outlined my analysis of Georgia and state election laws, I want to get into what has happened that has been disappointing for me about how the Democratic Party has handled the voting bill that's supposed to do the things that I say I support. It came to my attention when somebody said that there were senators, quote unquote, debating the bill in the Senate. And I don't think the person who was talking about it to me understood that it was actually the filibuster, that it was actually the Republican Party just debating a bill to shut it down and preventing it from passing. So people got excited that two senators were actually debating a bill without realizing that it was just debating it to shut it down, not debating it to actually improve it. During that debate, Senator Collins made a statement because her particular support of voting rights came into question, and she stated there are other bills in 1965 and 2006 that were very concise bills, and they were about voting rights. But this bill that the Democrats created was neither of those things. This bill was 700 pages long. I have a book that's 800 pages long, and it's this thick. That means that the bill was not just about voting rights. When my father had read the bill, told me the kinds of things that it did not prioritize common sense things that we could all agree on. What it sounded like were that some extremists in the party wanted to include every fantastical obstacle removal for anyone who wanted to vote. People who were not citizens, which I know is a gray area because we do have a population of dreamers, and maybe there should be special dispensation in a separate amendment to create the ability for. There needs to be, I feel like the voting rights bill is not the way and the place to address the issues around dreamers not being able to vote. I feel like the voting rights bill should have done the things that I've said I support federal intervention for, and the Constitution supports. The Constitution allows, even though the Constitution specifies that states are in charge of setting their own laws and running their own elections, the Constitution does allow the federal government to intervene and create certain guidelines that all of the states have to fall within. So the Constitution allows it, a certain guideline setting at the federal level, but still holds that the ultimate decisions about how elections are run are at the state level. My father's point of view was that there was always an understanding that some states would be fairer than others, whether we like that reality or not. And he said that the reason that states were told and put in charge of running their own elections was so that the states that were less fair than others would not be allowed to override the other states. So it was part of, in his mind, part of the system of checks and balances. That the reality is some states might have more or less fair election laws than others. Therefore, you want all of the states to be in charge without federal government intervention so that there is balance, so the states that have fair election laws can balance out the states that don't, was his rationale and logic behind this being part of a system of checks and balances in his mind. I was hoping the Democratic Party would do that, would intervene in a very concise, focused way to focus on the issues at hand, rather than trying to launch a very broad net that will ultimately lead to people like my father and a backlash where they get taken out of power rather than allowed to continue on and getting things done and passing bills. However, I think this demonstrates the need in the Democratic Party for maturity and discipline. They need to learn how to create policies and bills that are focused on some core issues rather than trying to do everything at the same time. So, for example, create a bill that everyone can support based on some very reasonable common sense core issues. Pass that bill so we have protections in place that no matter what state governments try to do, there are certain lines that they cannot cross. I'm in favor of that at both the state and the federal level at this stage, seeing what we are seeing today. I would like to see the Democratic Party become more disciplined in creating these bills rather than trying to put everything and the kitchen sink into one bill. I mentioned as an example the Dreamers' ability to vote. They're already as a whole, that is a bigger problem. They need paths to citizenship. So making an exception for them and saying even though that they're not citizens, they should be allowed to vote is a band-aid. It does not fix the problem that they need path to citizenship. So I think that that's where the Democratic Party frequently doesn't discern different topics. They try to lump too many topics together. They say, well, we're going to address this one issue, then we're going to say that everything else is part of that issue, instead of just separating out this issue, focusing on this issue, getting that bill passed. Because if you get that bill passed and people see that you're in control and you're making progress, we want to continue that you keep your job. We don't want to take your job away if you're demonstrating competence in areas like writing very focused, concise bills that get the job done and get approval. That's what we want to see. If you're in a legislative position, and that's not what you're doing, then you probably won't keep your job very long because that's the job description. And so to become better at that job, the Democratic Party definitely needs to get better at very disciplined, focused, concise bill writing. Since that was the core issue, everything else that happened as a reaction to that core issue ignored the responsibility for that core issue. So last week, what happened is the Arizona Senator, Sinema, who has also run on a very moderate platform. So I can look at her and I can see the logic behind what she's saying. If you're here today, this is the kind of analysis that I'm here to give you. She told her state, and she has been very clear. Biden has said very clearly what their conversations have been like. She has made it very clear all fall that her position is that she wants moderate bills to be passed that do not trigger the kind of knee-jerk overreaction response like my father has to this bill. Because democracy is not about one group saying, well, we want our one priority to be the rule for everyone. It's about different groups coming together and compromising according to their priorities. If one group says, we want this priority to happen, and this group says, well, that doesn't align with some of our priorities. For example, in this bill, somebody says, I want to remove any barrier to anyone walking in and voting. And this group says, we want to verify that everyone who votes lines up with somebody who's on a voting registry roll. Then you have to meet in the middle and compromise about how to create safety in that space where there is access to elections, but then there's also some checks and balances to make sure that the people who are voting are accurate. There's some accuracy to it. So both sides need to learn to compromise and hear the priorities of each other and meet in the middle. And I think that is what Sinema has been saying. She's been very clear on her strategy and her position on that. The reaction to her position. So she has a PR problem, not because she did not vote for this bill, not her position when she looks at the Democratic Party and acknowledges what I've just described is that they are on a power trip and they want to write bills chock full of mistakes, chock full of errors that are sloppy, and think that they can just pass them into law instead of having any discipline to write really constructive and good legislation. And she doesn't want them to just pass any old thing into law. So she feels like there needs to be some checks and balances to prevent them from just passing a bunch of nonsense that isn't thought out well into law. Contrary to the overreaction from the left this week, that does not make her the enemy. That makes her expectations higher. The response of the Democratic Party could be to take responsibility for that, to do the things that I've suggested to get some discipline and write better bills that are concise and are not 700 pages long. If they were doing that, then she wouldn't have to be the gatekeeper. If she saw that she was part of a party that understood their jobs correctly, then she wouldn't have to be on the outside if everyone could see her point of view. Bernie Sanders, it makes me feel like Bernie Sanders probably wrote this 700-page bill, since he's not very good at passing legislation. He's the amendment king. He only passes amendments. Bernie Sanders wrote this bill, has decided to be very petty and stab Sinema in the back and say that he is going to support somebody to run against her. The Arizona Democratic Party has said, we're not going to support her to be elected again. I want to be very clear. Arizona is not a Democratic state. Democratic voters are not in a majority there. Moderate voters in the middle are the swing voters in that state. Sinema won a Republican seat that was formerly held by John McCain by running on moderate platforms and a promise to be moderate. If Bernie Sanders thinks that taking her out of the presidential nominee primary and replacing her with somebody progressive will win in Arizona, he is sadly delusional. Both Arizona and the Democrats in the Senate need Sinema much more than she needs them. Without Sinema on the Democratic side of the ticket, if she were to switch parties, for example, which I don't think she would do because the Republican Party would require her to compromise on her position. But if she were, then the Democrats would lose control in the Senate. And right now, if I were in Sinema's point of view and they were having a meltdown because I told them they needed to do a better job writing bills, I would be heavily tempted to leave the caucus and leave them in a position of not having a majority in the Senate. But she's not doing that. So I think the fact that she's not doing that demonstrates that she recognizes that she's not abandoning them completely. But I can see the level of frustration she has with this very immature response to understanding the job and reacting to how she's handling the situation. So that's my take so far on the events that we've seen. I think if this were September, the Democrats could expect to wake up in November and lose one or both houses. I hope that they can learn from this lesson since it's early in the year. I hope they can start to do a better job. I hope they can start to take responsibility because moderate voters are watching. We're watching how you behave. We're not fooled. Because what they do is they know they've written this bill with all of these other things in there. They try to sell it to all of the people on the left. This is a voting rights bill. And anyone against it, anyone impeding it, is against voting rights, not against bad bills. I support a bill for voting rights. I do not support the bad 700-page long bill that's not about voting rights. So what I see on the left is inability to distinguish between those two things. It's false advertising to call the 700-page bill about a lot of other things besides voting rights a voting rights bill that anyone opposing it is opposed to voting rights. This is the kind of bad political game that has gotten us into this polarized situation. The only way out of this polarized situation we are in is for the Democratic Party to stop repeating these behavior patterns, to recognize where they can take responsibility for changing the norms that we're seeing. Thank you for joining me today. This has been The Middle Ground. This is my take on the recent events surrounding the voting rights bill. If you want to see me tackle any other topics, let me know. Like and subscribe and follow. See you soon.